literature would seem on the surface a type of literature that is not concerned with questions of literary style. And thus it may seem at first a fool's errand to even ask about the language and literary style of ascetical texts in the Orthodox tradition. Whether it is the sayings of the Desert Fathers, the writings collected in the Philokalia, or the Ladder of Divine Ascent of St. John Climacus, these all present their ideas in a plain, straightforward style. There is little use of ornamentation, rhetorical figures are largely absent, even the syntactical construction of the language is largely without complexity. The style of ascetic text certainly differs greatly from the style of, for instance, the Cappadocians, who were highly trained in classical rhetoric. But perhaps the question we ought to ask is why ascetic texts choose to use the style of language they do. Is there anything to be gleaned about the language of asceticism? And does the style of ascetic language inform the ideas expressed in these texts? Rather than consider the literature of asceticism as a whole, this paper will investigate the literary style of one particular work, the Ladder of Divine Ascent of St. John Climacus. This work needs little introduction for this audience. There are very few texts that are as central to the Orthodox tradition. Father George Florovsky, commenting on the literary style of this text in his work, Byzantine Ascetic and Spiritual Fathers, he takes note of what he calls the simple, almost folk language, and how the author loves the similes, proverbs, and sayings of everyday life. But is the language in fact so simple? And is the use of similes and proverbs an indication of a folk style, the language of everyday life? Now, the latter advocates for simplicity of speech, which it considers a hallmark of humility. But even with these claims of simplicity, the very structure of the text displays concern with figurative language. Consider what St. John says in step 27 on stillness, when he says, "I've put together a ladder of ascent, though my meager knowledge makes me something of a second-rate architect." This is not a literal, but a figurative ladder, of course. The spiritual ascent is like a ladder. We are in the realm of similes and metaphors, what in literary studies we designate as figurative language. And sprinkled throughout the text are striking and unexpected uses of figurative language, often in the form of similes and analogies. These often take the form of X is like a man who, followed by an absurd situation. For instance, in step 27, like a man who expects to walk quickly even though his legs are tied together. These comparisons cause us to pause and imagine and reflect. Why, yes, it would be hard to walk quickly if your legs were tied together. So in this paper, I'm going to look at these different types of comparisons and consider the rhetorical purpose behind the use of figurative language. While I'm not the first to draw attention to the literary style of the latter, discussions of this component of the work are few. There is a work in Serbian by Bogdanovich from 1968. John Duffy, the Byzantinist formerly at Harvard, published an article in 1999 in Dunbar Notes Papers entitled "Embellishing the Steps, Elements of Presentation and Style in the Heavenly Ladder" of John Climacus. And more recently is the book by Henrik Riddell Johnson, "Reading John Climacus, Rhetorical Argumentation, Literary Convention in the Tradition of Monastic Formation" from 2007. And in addition to these three works, the only other place where we find mention of the literary style are in introductions to modern translations. For example, Metropolitan Kallistos in his introduction to the edition published by the Paulus Press, where he says, and I quote, "At first sight, the Greek may seem abrupt and rough, but the book is in fact composed with subtlety and conscious art, in a rhythmic prose, often not far removed from poetry. The abruptness is intended. The author loves short, sharp sentences, pithy definitions, paradoxical aphorisms, for his purpose is to wake the reader up. He excels in quaint illustrations, marked by a monastic sense of humor that has amused his audience over the centuries. A consistent theme in this scholarship on the literary qualities of the text is that the surface impression of simplicity actually conceals the artfulness and craft of the composition. After all, we should not overlook how the plain or low style is itself a rhetorical choice. And one effect of these literary devices is then to wake the reader up. Something that I hope to do by looking at some of these examples from the latter. I've tried to assemble these according to different categories, so this is by no means an exhaustive list. And the first grouping is comparisons to animals, and I won't go through these in details. We get comparisons very often to dogs, some comparisons to snakes, a comparison to horses, birds, but let's spend our time looking at some of the comparisons to physical activities. First, in step 3 on exile, but the man who believes in dreams is like someone running to catch up with his own shadow. Running, a physical activity, but we know that we cannot catch up with our own shadow. A normal situation is taken to an absurd extreme. Or again, in step 6 on remembrance of death, the man who wants to be reminded constantly of death and of God's judgment, and who at the same time gives in to material cares and distractions, is like someone trying at the same time to swim and to clap his hands. We should try this. Try to clap in water as you are swimming. They're two normal activities, right? Swimming and clapping your hands. But they can't be combined, right? Just as you can't be concerned with material concerns and think of the final judgment at the same time. Or again, step 9 on malice, when he says, forgive quickly and you will be abundantly forgiven. To forget wrongs is to prove oneself truly repentant. But to brood on them and at the same time to imagine one is practicing repentance is to act like the man who is convinced he is running when in fact he is asleep. Right, so again we're in the realm of dreams, similar to the one we saw earlier, but imagining that we're running but in fact we are asleep. Or step 27 on stillness, we have another like a man comparison, where he says, the man who wishes to offer a pure mind to God, but who is troubled by cares, is like a man who expects to walk quickly, even though his legs are tied together. Now, often these will go in the direction of the absurd or the paradoxical. And so let's look at a few of these. Step 14 on gluttony, and the man who looks after his belly, and at the same time hopes to control the spirit of fornication, is like someone trying to put out fire with oil. Step 22 on vainglory. Therefore, as the occasion demands, let us talk about the unholy vice of self-esteem, the beginning and completion of the passions. And let us talk briefly, for to undertake an exhaustive discussion would be to act like someone who inquires into the weight of the winds. Step 23, on pride, to tackle the demon of blasphemy in any way other than this is to be like a man trying to hold lightning in his hands. I think you're going to notice a theme in the next few. Step 23, on pride, again, from the same step, try to fight it and you will end up by surrendering. For the man who tries to conquer spirits by talk is like someone hoping to lock up the winds. Right, so we're inquiring into the weight of the winds, trying to hold lightning in one's hands, hoping to lock up the winds. And then again, another one related to weather, and I think very applicable for today, step 25 on humility. Snow cannot burst into flames. It is even less possible for humility to abide in a heretic. And then, again, step 30 on faith, hope, and love, God is love, but someone eager to define this is blindly striving to measure the sand in the ocean. Right, so we see how in these examples we have this comparison. X is like someone who, and then a situation that is taken to an extreme, where it becomes absurd, where it becomes paradoxical. Now, let's consider the purpose behind these literary devices. Whether we call them folksy, the language of everyday life, like Father George Filarowski, or if we try to look at the rhetorical purpose, what we want to think about is how they work. What is the effect of these devices? And so I'll offer some observations. And I think the first observation we can make is that they are memorable, right? They stick with you. The second observation is that it gives a sense of variety to the text, right? When I just give them to you here out of context, it's certainly a different experience than when you are reading the work and they come at these moments and they're quite unlike the rest of the text. So I think this is why Metropolitan Callisto says they wake you up, right? They're memorable, there's some variation. And then the next observation, this is something that John Duffy talks about in his article in Dunbar and Oak's paper, where he relates them to the Homeric simile. And that is, they use the unfamiliar to explain the familiar, right? Because this is the kind of juxtaposition that we see in the epic poetry of Homer, where something very familiar, agricultural activities, are compared to these grand moments of troops gathering for battle. And then, lastly, my final observation is more about the theoretical purpose. And I would argue that these uses of figurative language are at the very heart of what St. John is doing in the latter, because they invite us in with something concrete, something tangible, right? Swimming, clapping hands. We know what the wind is. We know what the snow is like. There's something we can relate to. And to explore this last observation somewhat more, I want to end by dwelling on the comparison that St. John uses at the very beginning of step 25 on humility. And it is a striking comparison. I didn't give it to you in my list earlier, because I want to really unpack this one. And it uses the sense of taste. And what is even more striking is how this passage is full of rhetorical terminology. And so here's the passage from the edition of Holy Transfiguration Monastery. And I quote, "He who thinks that it is possible to use the visible word in order to describe the awareness and effect of the love of the Lord exactly, holy humility gracefully, blessed purity truly, divine enlightenment clearly, the fear of God honestly, or assurance of heart unerringly, and imagines that by his description of things of this kind, he will enlighten those who have never actually experienced them, is like a man who by words and comparisons wants to give an idea of the sweetness of honey to people who have never tasted it." Many of the terms in this passage you also find in the rhetorical handbooks. The verb that he uses to describe is the word that you find in the rhetorical handbooks for narration or to narrate. And likewise, the words used for what is being described, that is the awareness and the effect, aesthesis and energia. And the rhetorical handbooks mention how there are different styles of narration and how one component of narration should be that it be vivid, energis. And this is the word that is translated here as the adverb clearly. So this is not the time or the place to examine the extent of St. John's familiarity with the rhetorical tradition, but it does not seem accidental that this one passage should contain so many words from the rhetorical tradition. What is of interest, and what reveals the purpose behind the use of these literary devices, comes in what St. John says of these rhetorical tools. He uses the language of rhetoric to make the point that rhetoric fails to convey the experience of the spiritual life. Because, according to this passage, one cannot describe or give a narration with vividness and clarity of something that is beyond the scope of language. It is like describing the sweetness of honey to one who has never tasted honey. Words fail when it comes to describing tastes. Likewise, words fail to describe the love of God, humility, blessed purity, and so on. And yet, as often happens in critiques of language and rhetoric, what is one left with? Words to describe the incapacity of words. St. John must use a clever comparison to honey and this witty use of figurative language to make the very point that comparisons and figurative language are mere approximations. Analogies fill the gap between the familiar and the unfamiliar. And I think this is more than just a folk style. I think this is something that has a very long heritage, going all the way back to the earliest poets. Why Homer uses comparisons to a great swarm of geese and crane taking off in the marshes to describe the gathering of troops before the walls of Troy. Because it takes the familiar to explain the unfamiliar. And this is why we need to pay attention to how these rhetorical devices are used. The latter is crafted as an elaborate metaphor, comparing the spiritual life to the advancement up a ladder. Yet the verbal description alone is not enough. One cannot simply read about this spiritual life, just as one cannot read about the taste of an unfamiliar food. One must taste the food to experience it, and one must experience the journey. Or again, turning to Metropolitan Kallistos in his introduction to the Paulus Press edition, where he says, convinced as he is of the need for encounter and participation, for direct tasting and touching, John's aim in the latter is not to inculcate abstract teaching or to impose a formal code of ascetic rules, but to evoke in his readers an experience similar to his own. As the late Father George Florovsky put it, the latter is an invitation to pilgrimage. That is, the text invites us to participate, and only through participation can we begin to perceive what it is that St. John is describing. Because as he claims in step 25 on humility, learn not from an angel, nor from a man, nor from a book, but from me, that is, from my indwelling, from my illumination and action in you. And yet, we are given this advice to learn not from a book, where else but in a book. So we have rhetoric used to show the limits of rhetoric and to give expression to the central paradox that St. John must rely upon figurative language to talk about the inadequacy of language.